Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to give it about another 30 seconds and we'll get things started. Great. Thank you all so much for joining today's conversation and welcome. I'm Alexis Williams, Executive Vice President at the Stagwell Group, and it's a pleasure to host you. Today's conversation, why CEO reputation and why it matters, is going to be a fascinating one, and we really are looking forward to it. The reputation of a CEO has an oversized impact on a company's reputation, according to new Harris Poll data just released. In fact, half of all consumers say they change their buying decisions based on the actions of the CEO. Throughout today's conversation, we will discuss which CEOs are most admired and why their reputation matters. We hope today's conversation is useful to you all as we try to navigate the new world we're living in, and hope you find the data as well insightful. With that said, we're about to start the discussion, and to do that, I need to introduce our fantastic panelists. First off, Ray Day, who's Vice Chair of the Stagwell Group. Ray brings 30 years of experience leading global communications for two of America's most iconic brands, IBM and Ford Motor Company. He brings immense experience in the strategic communication space, particularly the combination of storytelling and a data-driven approach. Ray, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
CEO of the Harris Poll. John is a New York Times best-selling author and pioneer in the use of data to identify social change and help companies anticipate and adapt to new trends and demands. Since the start of the pandemic, John has led the single largest consumer tracker of behavior and sentiment as it relates to COVID-19, turning those insights into actionable intelligence for businesses navigating the crisis. John, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Alexis.
Before we start the conversation, please know there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can use that to submit your questions at any point throughout the conversation, and we'll be collecting those and answering them at the end. So please do that. We look forward to them. And this session is set to go through about 1:20 p.m. After that, and sometime this afternoon, we'll have the video posted on both the Stagwell LinkedIn page and the YouTube channels. And so with that, if we could go to the next slide. The data we'll cover today falls into three main categories. First, the reputation and environment, society in transition and turmoil, discussing what's happening across the world as it relates to COVID and really what's happening in the minds of American consumers. Second, reputation in business. What are the expectations? What are the risks? And how do people engage? And finally, we'll look at the CEO, the authority, the obligations, and what is it that a CEO needs to do, and what Ray conveniently calls the thunderstorm of American mindset. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Ray to start the dialogue, and looking forward to a great conversation. Ray, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and it's great to see people joining from all around the world. If we move to the next slide, it's great to be here because reputation is a longtime passion of mine. And the reason is really the title that we put on the webinar today, Reputation Matters. And you can see just three prominent business leaders here and their thoughts on reputation. But for me, and it's great to do this webinar with my partner, John Gerzema, and the Harris Poll, a group that I have worked with for a couple of decades on measuring reputation, understanding its levers, and really understanding what it is and what it's not in American business today. And what I've learned about reputation in my 30 years in corporate America is that first and foremost, reputation needs to be a bottom line business measure. It's one, as I said, I've always measured, and I've always asked that I personally be measured by my ability and my team's ability within the communications world to improve reputation. Reputation should be a board level discussion, and it should be a board level discussion all the time, not just during a crisis or after a crisis, but it should be one of the business imperatives and one of the things that's reported on at least a quarterly basis and have a board discussion. The reason we're focusing on reputation, and particularly on the CEO, there's several studies, as we say reputation matters, that say that the reputation of a company represents at least a third, if not a half, of a company's market capitalization. And then there's equal studies that say the CEO, he or she directly or indirectly affects at least half of how that reputation goes. So reputation matters, and the CEO's influence on reputation matters more than ever. Now, if we just go to the next slide, I want to talk about, as we get into this conversation, we're going to throw a lot of data your way and hopefully have a very engaging discussion. But it's really important that we're all calibrated and we have a common definition of what reputation is and what it's not. And there's been lots of talk, particularly in the last 2 years since the Business Roundtable came out with the purpose principles, on things like purpose and character and ethics and culture. And it's all great discussion, but as I reflect on it, it's part of the discussion. They are all elements of reputation. And what I really see happening at the board level today, particularly with the clients that we at Stagwell and MDC are working with, is the pendulum swinging back from individual elements of reputation to wholesale reputation. And also not just looking at risk as it relates to reputation, but looking at opportunity as it relates to our reputation. So again, I think the first macro trend we see is that reputation matters, and it's starting to become a holistic discussion again, as it should be. Now, I think the second point, as we're going through the calibration and making sure we're all speaking a common language, is there is a difference between reputation and brand. Reputation is commonly the measure of what all stakeholders perceive about your company. And that's shareholders, that's employees, that's communities, that's certainly your customers, it's policymakers, governments, all that give you a license to operate. Brand, on the other hand, as you can see here, is typically a measure of products and services and typically among a specific group of customers. And I always like to say, you can create a brand, but you earn a reputation. And one of the things that I push back on anytime I go into a company or meet with a team that's trying to get its arms around reputation is you can't manage reputation. You can't put a campaign together or do a slick ad campaign or a marketing program. Reputation is an outcome. And since I always like to think of reputation as an equation and kind of think of it in scientific terms. And the equation that I always love to use when I approach reputation is the sum of performance plus behavior plus communication equals reputation, either up or down. And just to give you a couple illustrations from a company level, or even think of an athlete, you can have fantastic performance and poor behavior in poor communications and destroy your reputation. We've seen some politicians of late kind of wade into those areas of questionable behavior, really poor communications, and they've created themselves a bit of a hole to dig out of. On the flip side, if all three of these are working in tandem, strong performance, strong behavior, plus strong communications, reputation will grow. And the Harris poll has been tracking reputation on a syndicated basis for the last 2 decades, which means we have an annual study called the Reputation Quotient, which goes out and looks at all the companies in America, the most visible, rated, and then looking at the reputation of those companies. And the reputation is judged based on performance plus behavior plus trust equals reputation. And what we found in the last year in particular, as it relates to COVID, is that with regard to company reputation, performance has become table stakes. Behavior or character is really the differentiating point today from a company standpoint on reputation. And the study that we're going to talk about today is new research we put into the field about CEO reputation. And in the parallel way, we're seeing the very same phenomenon. It's not enough today for a CEO to deliver fantastic products and services or even fantastic financial results. The CEOs today are being judged by character, by humility, by what they're made of, and how they engage with stakeholders. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Really, for CEOs, It's more than mastery of the marketplace. It's about a commitment to serve society, and a commitment to serve stakeholders. So what we're also going to find in the data today, and John's going to take us through it, but there is a massive divide today on the role CEOs and in parallel companies should take in social issues and political issues. And it's divided based on demographics as well as age. And you're going to see that we're certainly not a country that's one size fits all. And one of the common questions I get as a communications leader is, what should I do as a company with regard to X, Y, or Z social or political issue? And you're going to see from the data that there is no easy answer, but we'll walk through some recommendations at the end. But just as John goes through, I just want to tick off a few kind of huge aha insights that we took away, John and I did, from the data in the study that we just completed. The first is that half of Americans have changed their buying habits due to a CEO's actions, either on the plus side or the negative side. So when we talk about a CEO having at least 50% or more influence on a company's reputation, we're seeing it in these data as well. Young people, as we had this debate in the business roundtable debate over which stakeholder, which is the most important, is it shareholders or customers or employees or someone else? Young people believe it's employees, not customers, that are the number one stakeholder today. It's different for other age groups, but as we're trying to attract this new cohort of young people, it's really, really important data to heed. A third point, ethical standards are the highest valued CEO quality today, above setting the company vision and above having outstanding products and services. A fourth point, humility is the number one undervalued attribute of a CEO today. And then when we talk about this thunderstorm that was mentioned earlier about the role that CEOs today, just listen to these data. 72% of Americans, older Americans, believe there is more risk than reward in speaking out for a CEO on social issues. 72% of older Americans, but 56% of younger Americans and 55% of Black Americans say exactly the opposite. So we have this thunderstorm of views. The CEO's job has never been tougher. And if we just go to the next slide, as we talk about reputation matters, you can see the data. It's our license to operate. It gives us permission. It gives us greater, people want to buy our stock. They want to work for our company. And very importantly, we all get into crisis from time to time. The companies that take reputation seriously and that have excellent reputations recover far faster and far more resiliently than anyone else. So with that as a preamble, I'm going to turn over to John to dig into the data, to talk more about corporate reputation, but very specifically, what's the role and what's that thunderstorm for CEOs today?
Thanks, Ray. That was a really great setup, and it really sort of dimensionalizes the challenges that today's CEOs face. I think what we'll do is we'll start and look on the next slide at a little bit of our COVID data to really sort of anchor this thunderstorm that Ray just described. So as he mentioned, we have been in the field tracking all kinds of different aspects of American sentiment toward COVID. And this is a chart that basically shows that fear that we've been tracking, fear of all kinds, right? Fear of a global recession, fear of leaving home for essential errands, which started at 80%. All of these finally over the last 10 days, and I should mention the data on the far right, we'll circulate all this so it's a little bit more legible, but basically all of this data that's just coming out of the field from this weekend, we're starting to see signs of fear abating. And this is pretty remarkable for us because these levels of fear of not leaving the home, fear of returning to public activity, they've all held in the very sort of high 80s to low 70s, and they're finally starting to tick down over these past 2 weeks, including this past weekend. And part of that is obviously part of what's going on. We're seeing Cases now are down 62% in terms of COVID. Over the last 28 days, hospitalizations are down 55%. So there seems to be a sense of a little bit of a sort of fear abating. At the same time, it's interesting to note sort of how disapproval of the vaccine rollout has ticked up 2 points, probably related to the storms across the country over this past week. Next. So what's really important, what Ray and I have really been sort of focused on, is how is that going to start to change in terms of Americans gaining confidence, right? We're seeing upticks in consumer confidence, upticks about a 5.3% uptick in retail activity, related most notably, economists think, to sort of the stimulus checks that hit earlier. So what's still worrying us is this orange set of orange bars, right? This is the percent of people that say they're not comfortable engaging in these types of activities. So 37% visiting family or friends without a mask, 42% staying in a hotel, 59% shopping without a mask, going to an indoor party, 55%, et cetera. Until we can start to see those move, we're going to continue to sort of have this sort of suppression on the economy. Next. Now, what's really important to look at is what's going on with vaccine acceptance. If you look at the bottom of this chart on the left, you can see right when there was news that Pfizer and Moderna and others were beginning work on vaccines back in April of 2020, there was a high degree of enthusiasm and interest in getting the vaccine. In fact, 73% of Americans said they were likely to get it. Now, what happened over the course of the election season is vaccines, as you know, became a political football. And that number began to go down dramatically, including reaching its sort of lowest point right around the election, about only 58% of Americans saying they were going to get it, 42% saying not likely. Now, what's happened is it started to tick back down. As of this past week, we see 68% saying that they're likely, 32% saying not likely. It's actually the not likelies have gone up slightly by 2%. But what's really important to understand is that across key demographic groups, there has been a decline. We've seen a decline in Hispanic, a decline in Black Americans, a decline in white Americans. Across the board, there seems to be less sort of resistance to getting the vaccine. Next. What I want to stress here, it's really important though, is that the questions among the people who are not likely to get the vaccine, it's very much a misnomer to characterize them as anti-vaxxers. That's not really the case. There's actually a lot of very valid, legitimate questions and concerns that the general public have. So the green bar, let's just focus on that. You can focus on the age breakouts if you'd like, but just across the general public in green, listen to the kinds of questions that they have among those that say that they're not likely to get it. Well, number one, I'm worried about side effects at 57%, 52%. I think they rushed the development too quickly. 44% said, I don't trust the government to make it safe. What's really important here is to understand too, sort of the cultural overlays in this, including the fact that we saw among Black Americans a significant jump, almost 10 to 15 points on many of these questions, particularly including I don't trust the government. And the reason why is next. If you go next, please. Nope, back. Okay, so this issue of racial mistrust in healthcare is another really seemingly misunderstood by the general public aspect of systemic injustice in our country. So just look at the differences between when we ask between white and Black Americans, how much do you trust the opinions of the following people across the healthcare industry? Look at the delta between the trust of doctors and 65% versus Black Americans at 41%, healthcare workers, 51 to 33, et cetera. And then a general level of miscomfort on the right-hand side about getting the vaccine in various locations, where you have the fact that only half of Americans, Black Americans, are trusting in going into a doctor's office to get the vaccine. So those are the cultural barriers that we're facing as we sort of move through this process. And I should also note, I think Reagan or Alexis were getting some questions, so please feel free to cut me off and ask those questions as we go along. Next. I think, I'm not going to go through all this, but I think what's really important to understand is modeling behaviors inside communities is already having an impact on increasing vaccination rates and is critically important. So the most important number in this chart is the 66% at the top that said, seeing the people I know get the vaccine first makes me more comfortable to get the vaccine myself. And so that becomes a really important aspect of working through our communities, through our parishes, our churches, our local influencers, to really sort of guide and model that behavior. Next. So that's just a little bit of an overview of sort of where we're seeing from a societal standpoint. Now we're going to go a little bit deeper into the opportunity that we see for business to set the stage for our reputation data on CEOs. So the first really important thing to note is that business in previous crises, like the global financial crisis 10 years ago, was really seen as part of the problem. This time, business was seen as part of the solution. And this is a tracking between January of 2020, before COVID, which is the orange line, and February of 2021. You can basically see how much each of the various sectors improved in overall reputation. So the way to read this is that 32% of Americans believe a more positive reputation in the pharmaceutical industry, and that actually ballooned up during COVID to 62% as of this past month, February 2021. What's really interesting in this is that even though so many other institutions have been decimated, business really held serve. And we'll look at that as we go into the next couple slides. Next. So look at this. This is a question that we ask in our Harvard CAPS Harris poll. Do you distrust or trust the following institutions or individuals? And what's really remarkable, among American voters, 69% mistrust social media, 56% mistrust Congress, 55% the president, national media sits at 52%. And as you work your way down, all these other staples of our democracy are really under attack today, as you know. The mischaracterization, the misinformation, the way that we gather our truths has sort of created, obviously, this division. I think what's really important is that previous data I just showed you really shows that business has sort of been inoculated from that mistrust. Across those sectors, we showed you that their reputation has risen even while other institutions have fallen. And I think it's important to understand that one anomaly inside this is really social media in terms of overall business reputation. We asked a question, do you agree or disagree that American companies should unite to urge Congress to take steps to regulate social media companies? And we have a 7 out of 10, 70% agreement on that principle. Next. So it's really important to understand Americans are looking for business to lead on COVID and to get us through the divisiveness of January 6th. And so 68% say the nation needs our business leaders now more than ever to help us lead out of COVID, racial injustice, and other inequities. And as you look at those numbers, you can basically see there's strong support, as well as the belief, 63%, 2/3 nearly, that this is a moment of unprecedented national division and strife where the nation lacks leadership and company CEOs can step into the void with clear voices and plans to help the country heal. So that becomes a helpful sort of stepping stone that we're going to talk about as Ray and I get into this CEO reputation data. There are sort of a 2/3 approval of Americans to say that business leaders can get in there and help us do more. Next. Now, just real quickly, we're also seeing business rising in terms of their estimation of the public to get involved and to help with their expertise in logistics and others in order to distribute the coronavirus vaccine. That has continually ticked up since September, now into February. Next. The other thing we've seen is that many industries have a public permission to require vaccine passports. I know in many conversations we're having with our clients, that's been a bit of a concern, but across different industries, there's basically 2/3 of Americans across most of these believing that it's okay for the airline industry, for example, to have a vaccine passport before passengers can board a plane. or attending a business conference or going to a sporting event or concert. Next. Also, just really important to the esteem rise in business has been logistics. And clearly, this has been an unprecedented year for logistics, and that's the #1 place where Americans think that business could get involved to assist in the rollout of the COVID vaccine, followed by ways that they could convert their space to create vaccine clinics and other ways in which they could help. Next. So that's another really stepping area into talking now about CEO reputation. Here's Ray, we're going to kind of go back and forth here and have a discussion on these slides, because as you teed them up, I think they're absolutely fascinating. There's some really interesting data in here that sets up both the peril and the promise of being a CEO leader today. So let's get right into it. So the first thing we see is that when we ask the question, how much of an impact do you think CEO of a company has on each of the following aspects of a company? You really see that strong, broad, and wide mandate that CEOs have to lead. So #1, 85% of Americans believe it's the reputation of the company, but 84% believe that CEO, she or he, are setting the company's ethical standards. Obviously, as well, the financial success of the company and its long-term vision at 83%, and 80% driving the importance of the culture, the diversity and inclusion, as well as the employee morale and the quality even of the products and company services, along with its stock price. But really, the reputation of the company, as Ray described, is really increasingly right in the hands of the CEO, according to Americans. Now, what we also see is really the importance of what I called in my 2013 book, The Athena Doctrine, the rise of soft skills, the focus on ethics, on character, on trust, on humility, and empathy. And these really have become the things that have become very important to sort of guiding the modern CEO. And you're going to see that these skills become far more important as we start to look at how she and he must manage the very changing demographics in America. So what attributes do you most admire in a CEO? 32% ethical standards, 24% being trustworthy. And then what qualities are most overlooked or undervalued? Humility, 31%, consistency and steadiness at 29%, and again, that empathy at 27%. Now, Ray, I'd be really curious to see what you kind of see out of this data, but we asked a kind of an interesting question here. We said, if you were going to start a company today, which of the following current or former CEOs would you be among your top choices to go into business with? And clearly we see that there's sort of a big three, Bezos, Musk, and Cook, that really outperformed, for example, Mark Zuckerberg or even Jack Dorsey, who was at about 13% from Twitter. Some of the other CEOs are mentioned, you can see on this slide. I do think it's important to note that there is some awareness hurdles, obviously, with some of the other CEOs that we put into this survey. This was a list of CEOs that had some level of awareness to Americans. This was not an unaided. But Ray, what was your take on this slide?
Yeah, obviously, tech continues to rule, but I think what's interesting is we look at some of these CEOs and we look at the most recent 2020 reputation quotient results, and these are the same companies. And what really propels some of these CEOs and these companies is, yes, they're all, for the most part, profitable, growing companies that have a vision that people can relate to. But by and large, with a couple of exceptions, most of these CEOs are known for what they're doing for their employees. They're known for what they're doing for the community. They're known for what they're doing for society. These are not a group of CEOs that are just focused on the bottom line and the pure profits and the shareholders. You take this group, I would say at least 75% of them have made their mark because of what they're doing in the world, making the world a better place. And I think that's my biggest takeaway is, it goes to what we measured and what is increasingly becoming important If you think of the three major buckets of what make up reputation, there's performance, there's character, and there's trust. And trust is the glue that holds it all together. Performance is table stakes, the character is the differentiator, and trust is the common denominator that can't be breached.
And they're really going to need that trust when we get into the managing the really diverse constituencies across America when it comes to sort of the CEO's role. But I absolutely agree with you. Let's take a look at a few of the other things that we found. Next, please. So also Ray, I thought this was super interesting, that CEOs not only have this growing public awareness, 63% say that they are very or somewhat aware of CEOs in the business world today. So a different dynamic maybe from 20 years ago. But then we asked them, how much are your decisions to buy and use products and services of a company influenced by who a company's CEO is? Really interesting. 4 out of 10 Americans, more than 4 out of 10, say a lot or some. So that is a new, I think, territory, don't you think, Ray, for sort of CEO impact?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the CEO is no longer, the CEO is certainly a public figure, always has been, is now more than ever, but it's the role of that CEO in the business, but in the business sector and in the world around him or her.
Really interesting. Let's look at a few other things that we found. In fact, half of Americans have actually said they've changed their buying habits due to those CEO actions. This was a question where you could select all that apply, and we asked, have you done either of the following due to the words or actions of this company CEO? And again, you can see a net 56% of Americans either stopped using or buying a company's products and services, or went out of their way to do so on the basis of the actions of those CEOs. So we're going to thread this needle a little bit more thinly as we kind of get into speaking out on social issues. But again, Americans are listening, and so is the consumer marketplace. They're acting on the words and actions of the CEO. Next. So one quick example, this was some data that we released last Thursday with Bloomberg, and it looked at whether you had a better or worse opinion of cryptocurrencies, or opinion of companies, that accept Bitcoin as payment. And clearly the move of Elon Musk, the $1.5 billion investment, gave corporate credibility to cryptocurrencies. We saw in our data 90% American awareness of cryptocurrencies, but only 56% rather said they had no clue how they work, right? So it's still a very, as we call it, a cryptic currency, not a crypto. But look what happens when you had an investment like that, a tacit endorsement. You have a 22% net better opinion, but look at what happens with the people that actually know about it. But it moves from 37 to 46 to 59%. So again, those types of actions can have big impacts on sort of, the credibility of an industry. Next. So a couple of other things now. Now we're going to start to wade into the tension. There's a lot of, as Ray pointed out at the beginning, cultural tension, multicultural tension, generational tension, and obviously sort of tension based on politics when it comes to the role of the CEO. First question we asked here is, what is the role of the CEO amid today's divisive political environment? We've been testing a lot of data since January 6th to try to understand sort of where business should be in this sort of quandary. And when we asked the question, CEOs are not politicians and should stay out of politics, that is a very strong jump among Republicans, where in fact, when we ask CEOs are responsible for expressing the values of the company, even if it means taking stands that could be alienating or controversial, look at the Democratic bump from 42% versus 19% of Republicans. So you can basically sort of see how that spectrum works. Next. We also asked, do you think CEOs have become more or less active in expressing their political views of that of their companies? Now you're going to start to see the layering in here of some of the interesting generational differences. So 44% say that CEOs have become sort of more active, but look at the difference, what's really interesting here. 50% of boomers, so that's above the norm, but only 30% of Gen Z. Interpreted the other way, Gen Z are saying that CEOs aren't doing enough. Now, the other side of the pie, do you think CEOs are being more active in expressing their own political views or those of their company? Is that a good thing or a bad thing for the company? Well, among those who said it was a good thing for the company at 32%, look again at those age jumps. You start to go from 36% of Gen Z to 53% of millennials. Remember, those millennials are now moving into the power of many companies versus only 16% of boomers. But then among those who said it was bad for the company at 46%, look at the bump again on boomers. So you're seeing this profile. Older, more conservative, more belief that speaking out on social issues is bad. But again, younger, particularly Gen Z and millennials, think that this is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing.
And John, when it comes to this divide, if you go back 2 slides, I think we pushed over one inadvertently. One, there you go. We've had this debate in America about which stakeholder matters the most. Well, there's no universal answer when it comes to the demographics. Maybe you want to go through this one.
Yeah, no, really interesting. Thanks for catching that, Ray. So, among customers, that's the #1 sort of part of the general public's view of what's the most important stakeholder priority. Now, again, this is all American data. But when you go deeper into the age breaks, you can see that boomers think that CEOs should be customer-centric, right? At 50%, but only 26% of Gen Z and millennials believe that. That's because their priorities are placed in some different places. Among the general public, they then say it's employees at 28%, but then look at Gen Z, they bump to 29%, and only 20% of boomers say employees are the most important. And again, you see a shareholder bump from 17 to 21% for older audiences. And then you also see a bump among communities. Communities is only 12% of the pie among all Americans, but again, those numbers pop more so for younger people and less so for older people. So I think what we're starting to see is a different set of distribution of priorities based on age. Reagan, if you could go forward and catch me up, that's a great catch, right? Next. I think we saw this. Okay, so then we asked, where's sort of, the risk reward spectrum on this? And basically what we're seeing is that the more socially active, that carries less risk and more reward among younger people. So we asked this question, when CEOs speak out on social issues, what do you think they're trying to accomplish the most? Interestingly, 42% say they're actually trying to attract new customers, right? That they're trying to use that platform to sort of make an effect in the consumer marketplace. 31% influence stock price and 27% engender employee goodwill. Very interesting. I would have almost guessed these to be in the opposite priority. Yet on the right-hand side, generally, is there more risk or reward in a CEO speaking out on social issues? So this is obviously the $64,000 question. But look what happens. Among the general public, they say it's more risk, but among more reward, more risk at 59%, more reward at 41%. So there's more risk averse here among the general public. But now we're going to layer in not just youth, but also look at multicultural and BIPOC. So here you can see among Black Americans, 55% believe there's more reward and only 44% believe there's more risk. So they're more on the reward side, as are younger people, Gen Z and millennials at 56 and 52%, while Gen X and boomers become more conservative on that issue. So not only are we seeing younger people, as Ray talked about, being sort of more focused on speaking out on social issues, you're also seeing that against multicultural audiences in America. Next. And in fact, younger Black Americans say there's also risk in not speaking out. We asked this question, when faced with a situation like the above, what is the bigger long-term risk to company reputation? 64% said in speaking out, the company has inserted itself into political issues that are unwinnable and bound to alienate, versus 36% say in not speaking out, the company has signaled its indifference. And again, you see this disagreement among Black Americans and among younger Americans, believing the company should take more of a stand in speaking out. Next. So then Black and younger Americans also say addressing social issues, it's not just about being good for business, it's a principle to them. So across the general public, we ask this question: companies should focus on their products and services and not on social issues. That's more than half of Americans. So among the general public, there's a belief at 52% that way, that they shouldn't speak out. But again, look at the differences between older Americans, which are going to be even higher on those numbers, versus Black Americans and younger Americans that disagree with that. Then on the other side, only 30% of the general public believe it's best to take a stand on social issues, even if it might offend some people. That's 30% of the total population. However, again, you see those numbers rise: 41% of Black Americans, 36% of millennials, for example. And then lastly, it's best not to take a stand because it might just be deemed as offensive. I think on this point, what's really important, Ray, is I know the old way overused adage about skate to where the puck is by Wayne Gretzky. I'm sure no one in business has ever heard that before, but I'm going to back it up with some interesting new data from the census. New census race, population, ethnic estimates have just been released, and it showed that nearly 4 in 10 Americans identify with a race or ethnic group other than white. And they suggest that 2020 will be the first decade in nation's history when the white population declined in numbers, and BIPOC will represent the majority of all Americans by 2040. So that's the really interesting sort of conundrum, I think, in this data that we've just been sharing and discussing. There is a world today, a world of older Americans, whiter Americans that are much more conservative on a number of these issues and speaking out, versus a burgeoning market of younger talent, more multicultural talent, new consumers that are coming into the marketplace that have different views. And that's the tension that we really want to get into this discussion. Let's just finish up with a few other quick things. Important to note too, that younger people are more vested in companies. And this was an interesting question that we asked among millennial investors, again, with this Bloomberg study that we did last week. When you purchase stock in an individual company, which of the following would you say influences your decisions? And clearly the financials are important at 56%. The company's good reputation is already described at 51%. Look how important those two are linked. And then a number of other things that relate to what investors typically look at. But just look at the pop between I'm a user of their products and services. It jumps from 31% among the general population to 38% among millennials. Or the company shares my values goes from 26% to 31% of millennials. And lastly, recommendations from social media. So it starts to put into context, you know, American AMC theaters and GameStop and all that discussion. Clearly, there was a lot of different social dynamics going on, but it was also important to understand that those companies were beloved on Main Street and among younger people. And so I think the sort of parallel here is younger people, as we talked about, are going to be more vested in companies and are going to be looking more closely at them, and perhaps more blurring the lines between admiring companies and using them, their products and services. Next. So lastly, I think we got two last charts and we want to get into the discussion. We did ask if Americans believe that companies were going to speak out, rather, what could they address? And the number one thing that Americans believed that companies really had a place to focus on was income inequality and fair earning wage. And those numbers really pop, again, a little bit among Black Americans. Other things were fighting misinformation, dealing with climate change, and again, increasing diversity among its leadership and workforce. So those are some examples of priority areas. And then I believe lastly, you know, I think there's a lot of room for more change should companies want to do it, because having said all that, talking about stakeholder value, when we just ask the simple question, do you agree or disagree with the various statements? 79% of Americans still believe that companies are most focused on shareholders and profits than they are on society. And again, that sort of seems to be the prevailing wisdom. And you can also see the biases in terms of Democrats versus Republicans. That's clearly a struggle that the business will need to continue to sort of mandate. So that's a quick look at our data. I think, the final conclusions, is we kind of have seen this, Ray, is I think we're getting a greater sense of permission from the public to address these complex social issues. We saw rising corporate reputation, and CEO reputation also has a wider aperture. We saw that in the data about impact on products and services and speaking out on and using ethics and humility. But that does, as you said, mean more than mastery of the marketplace. This is really leaders' commitment to serve society. How are leaders as servants, not just leaders as sort of shareholder value creators, becoming more important? And that really comes to the burden of leadership. We believe that the public, given the public believes that CEOs should stand on issues where they have credibility and constituency, and be wary of wading into issues where they don't have a voice or authority. I think this is critically important. And Ray, you and I've talked a lot about this. I know this is your belief that core values really should be that navigator.
Absolutely. And if you just go to the final slide, and then we'll take some questions. But I think what this underscores, Reagan, if you go to the next slide, just so people have our emails if you have additional questions that we don't get to, but more than ever, reputation matters. And you just have to put that in perspective. If whatever your organization, whatever your business is today, if this is not a board level discussion, it needs to be. And if it isn't, if you're not measuring reputation in a robust way, not in a flash poll way, but measuring reputation with multi-stakeholders, multi-geography, multi-complexity of issues, you need to start measuring it. And from a CEO perspective, the importance of the CEO's impact on reputation has never been stronger. And I think the common takeaway for both the corporate level and the CEO level is it's not enough to focus just on performance anymore. Companies are being defined by their character, and it's all being stitched together by trust. Performance is table stakes. Don't get me wrong. You can't let go of excellent products and services, but it is the character attributes that is defining the top 10 we see from a company standpoint and the top 10 we see from a CEO standpoint going forward. And with that, why don't we open up to some questions? I know we have quite a few.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So we have a bunch of questions. We actually had a whole series of scripted questions, but are going to skip those to get to what people have submitted. Just from a framing standpoint, I think John mentioned this at the beginning, but all of this data was fielded in the month of February. So it is all relevant. We had a question about whether this was fielded during the Trump administration or the Biden administration. So all of this was through the Biden administration.
That's correct, Alexis. And the data on everything on CEOs was just from this past weekend.
Yep. So first question, I think, John, this is probably for you. Could the fears during COVID be impacted by other major incidents in the US, like winter storms, especially when thinking it's declined over the past 2 weeks? Could this be due to people's attention being elsewhere?
I think it's an excellent question. Yes, I believe that's the case. And so you see in that chart, and we'll distribute these charts after the webinar, but it's moved a little bit like an EKG, but the numbers have held pretty steady, sort of into the high 70s, low 80s, but different things did happen over time. We had a lot of concern around ventilator shortages, and that got quickly replaced by sort of, fear of being able to get the vaccine. So yes, I do believe that we'll see some more change in these numbers, but the overall trend is it seems like fear is beginning to decline.
And just to add to that, John, we've been doing nearly 52 weeks of these data. And we've seen, as John said, an EKG's chart, we've seen some upticks and some downticks, but fear has been pervasive. There has been massive fear. And one of the things we've talked about is the job of business, communicators, marketers, is how do we help Americans? How do we help consumers get past this fear? I think the biggest change we've seen of late, the vaccine is causing fear to abate at a pace we haven't seen before.
That's correct.
So we predicted the vaccine would be a game changer from a health standpoint, certainly, but from a fear standpoint, a marketing standpoint, a communication standpoint, it is living up to that as well.
Great. Next question. We believe it's okay. I believe it's okay to boost your reputation among certain groups at the expense of other groups, but you do run the risk, and excuse my language, but of pissing some people off. Any insights on how you walk that tightrope?
Sure. Ray, you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll start, and John, maybe you can add on. I think when you look at reputation, it's really important that you look at reputation in a holistic way. And one of the things that I always counsel companies that I'm talking to that are looking at reputation, maybe with just the general population, or maybe just with consumers, you can't really measure or effectively, and I talked about robust measures of reputation. I'll go back to the definition, which is why I started with the calibration. Reputation is the outcome. It's the perception of all stakeholders' view of your company or your organizations. And I've spoken to several B2B companies that have argued with me that we don't need to care about consumers because we're not a consumer company. And I always push back that say, well, some of those same consumers buy your stock. And some of those same consumers send employees to your job fairs. And some of those same employees become community leaders in the communities where you want to do business. So as I approach reputation, first of all, from a measurement standpoint, you need to measure multiple stakeholders. And then from a business standpoint, you need to prioritize what are the most important stakeholders to deliver in the business plan. But it really rarely, or frankly never, would be just a singular stakeholder that would be enough to focus on. You really have to make sure, how does, I mean, you see it in the data. There is diverging views. We are becoming more targeted than ever, or we need to become more targeted than ever in our actions, in our communications, and our marketing. So I just stress again and again, a multi-stakeholder, a mixed measurement approach to stakeholder, to reputation is important. And then what you learn from that, you determine, okay, which stakeholders are most important to my business, to what I'm trying to achieve, my vision, my being, my values, and then you can make some business decisions about those trade-offs.
Yeah, my answer to that would be kind of three things. Number one, speak from your authority. Speak where your business is, where your, as Ray talked about, your values are, what are the priorities of the culture of your company. The second thing is find bipartisan issues. There's a lot of areas where companies can do good that are in education, in the environment, that are in income inequality, that are in gender inequality, lots of other sort of social issues that sort of can be directed. And then I think CEOs should remember that they have been given this mandate with the caveats that they want them to be more empathic. They want them to be more humble, as we talked about in the data. And that means being inclusive, which the other way around is don't be divisive. Don't go pick fights that make no sense taking.
Great. All right, John, I think this one's probably for you. When CEOs speak out on social issues, the data say they are trying to attract new customers. Do any say they are trying to do so in an effort simply to do the right thing? Was that response an option?
That's a great question. I don't have the data or the exact question in front of me. I think what I said earlier really is what surprised me was the flip, that there was a commercial angle to the CEO's actions rather than simply an ethical one. But we'll post that and we'll give you the answer to that question when we distribute the deck.
Great. And then more coming in. Do you have any data that correlates external reputation with internal employee perceptions of a company?
Yeah, I'll start there. And again, when you take a multi-stakeholder approach, I always say the first stakeholder, as you're measuring reputation and as you're engaging to improve reputation, has to be your captive audience. So we all have employees, every business, that has to be your starting point with measuring reputation, but also looking at what are the drivers of reputation. The next captive audience, if you have a franchise network, though, if you can't win with your employees or your franchisees, you have a reputation problem and a fundamental business issue, and you need to start there. So I think, again, as I talk about this mixed measurement, this mixed approach to reputation, it's the sum of all stakeholders. Start internally, start with the captive audience, and then move external. It's incredibly important. I think one of the things you're seeing in all of our data in these 52 weeks of COVID and the reputation quotient study that we do, it's very clear that the companies in the top 10 from a reputation standpoint, as we recut the numbers and looked at companies in various ways, well, how companies treated their employees during COVID had an exponential impact on reputation. Not just what they said, what they did for or not for employees had an oversized impact on reputation. So I just can't underscore enough, it's no longer about employee communications. It's about employee engagement as one of the key levers every company on earth needs to heed when it comes to growing reputation.
Great. Next question. Would love to know more about how you're defining trust and how is that being measured?
Yeah, so trust is in these questions, it was all part of our custom research polling. So wherever we would have leveraged the word trust, we would have asked that explicitly. In our RQ reputation model that Ray's described, we also have trust as one of our various indicators, but we look at a number of other things. We look at culture, we look at integrity, a range of sort of different dimensions. And if you want more information on that, please feel free to reach out to us.
Well, one of the things we're learning is that trust has become the great divider. Trust in institutions, trust in government. What we found during COVID in the last year is there is more trust in business than in government, and far more trust in business. And the other thing that kind of surprised us as we've gone through 52 weeks of tracking COVID is that trust in everything local has gone up exponentially. So local health, local science, local government, local media, and local community leaders. There is at least in our data a 10-point variable or a 10-point gain for everything local, which goes again to this from an engagement standpoint. We don't live in a country any longer where one size fits all and you can really have a national campaign. This hyper-targeted, hyper-local engagement model is more important than ever.
Great. And just being mindful of time, I think we have time for one more question. And everyone whose questions we didn't get to, John, Ray, and I will do personalized follow-ups to make sure we point you to the data and you have exactly what you need to answer that. So apologies we didn't get to everyone. But last question following sort of the trust narrative, with the distrust levels of media, social media, Congress, and the executive branches, where do you see the drivers and where do you see the parators of trust and reputation communication?
Ray, please.
So I probably need to dig into the question and maybe talk with the questioner a little bit more, but I believe that from a communication standpoint, whether it's the news media, social media, business communications, however you define communications, we are about to see the great shakeout based on trust. It's whom do you trust? And you're seeing the pushback in the last year on social media. Just look at the comments. Just look at people pushing in and saying, what's your source on that? Just in the last year, be it vaccine or COVID or politics, people are becoming more prone to asking for validation. So I think trust, whom do you trust? And it's an opportunity for some of the most iconic brands and institutions out there to really capitalize on, be it media organizations, but also businesses that are iconic institutions that people over time have trusted, have a massive opportunity right now, not just again from a products and service standpoint, but from a societal standpoint, because people trust them. But I think we're going to see a shakeout and we're going to see more than ever people asking, can I trust you? Be it social media, be it media, be it business.
John, any closing words before we wrap up?
No, thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Well, again, thank you, Ray. Thank you, John, so much for leading this conversation. As John mentioned, the data will be posted on our website. It actually is already live now. The presentation is. Anyone who asked a question that unfortunately we didn't have time to get to, we will be doing personalized follow-ups in the next 24 hours. A video will be posted online, and we'll send the link out to everyone that attended. And thank you so much. We welcome your feedback. If you have anything you'd like us to discuss or host another conversation around, please don't hesitate to reach out. But we so appreciate your time. We appreciate your questions and comments and look forward to the next conversation. So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.